SARC Talk. SARC is a nonprofit cancer research organization that develops and manages clinical research trials in pediatric and adult sarcomas. SARC Talk is a podcast to discuss activities of SARC, interview sarcoma research leaders, and review scientific initiatives in the sarcoma field.
Welcome to SARC Talk, episode 36. My name is Scott Okuno, a medical oncologist at Mayo Clinic and chief medical officer at SARC. At SARC Talk, we interview interesting people who are connected to sarcoma, where we can all share and spread the knowledge about sarcoma. Our guest today is Dr. Michael Wagner. He's senior physician and clinical research director at the Dana-Farber Cancer Center. He is a graduate of Harvard Medical School, and he did his internal medicine at Mount Sinai in New York. He did his fellowship in medical oncology at MD Anderson, and prior to coming to Dana-Farber Cancer Center in 2023, he was on staff at the University of Washington in the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Center. His interests are vascular sarcomas, among other tissue specialities as well. Please welcome Dr. Wagner. Thank you, Michael, for joining us today.
Yep, thank you for having me.
Well, part of this is to get a little bit of understanding with our audience, a little bit of your career path. So if you don't mind, can you share a little bit of how you went from coast to coast and how you ended back over in the East Coast at Dana-Farber and how you got interested in sarcoma?
Yeah, absolutely. So I first got exposed to sarcoma and even sort of learned of it when I was in medical school, where by the end of medical school, which was here in Boston, I was interested in oncology, and I was looking for a research project, and I got connected actually with George Dimitri. So as a fourth year medical student, I started working on a retrospective chart review of patients who were treated here at Dana-Farber. And then when I started my internship at Mount Sinai, since I had worked with Dr. Dimitri, a lot of folks said, "Oh, you have to work with this guy, Bob." So I said, "Okay, who's Bob?" So then I got connected with Bob Mackey at Mount Sinai. So when I was an intern and resident, I worked with him on a couple of projects. And then by then, when I started fellowship, they put me in continuity clinic with Dr. Benjamin at MD Anderson. So I think by then I was pretty firmly set on a career path in sarcoma. But I think really the reason that I stuck with it was because I had such great mentors and all of those people, and even later on. And it's such a, I would argue, understudied group of diseases with so much need that I felt it was a good area for me to continue in.
It's interesting when you say that, and earlier on, you probably didn't even think about sarcoma, but hey, you were fourth year at medical school. You met George Dimitri. For those that don't know, he is, kind of the person who started GIST and moved us along. And then you met Bob, Dr. Mackey, along the way. And then you met the person who was the pillar down at MD Anderson with Dr. Benjamin. So yeah, you've had some good mentoring along the way. Then after MD Anderson, you did go out to Seattle. And can you share a little bit of how that was out there and kind of what brought you back over to Dana-Farber?
Yeah, so I think Seattle was just a good opportunity as far as a career goes, where I was looking for a sarcoma faculty position, and just because sarcoma is such a rare group of diseases, there were only so many faculty positions out there, and I thought that was a good fit for me. So I moved out west. I'm actually originally from the East Coast, so that was the shift west, first to Texas and then to Seattle, was a bit of a change for me. And then after a little over 6 years there, the opportunity came up in Boston, and I thought it would be nice to move closer to family. And of course, the resources that we have here at Dana-Farber are excellent in terms of the potential to do exciting research. And I moved here just a little over 2 years ago.
Well, you might not remember, you and I shared Uber or a taxi or some type of shuttle, and you were talking at that time about vascular studies about, tumors, and you were thinking about, maybe EHE, and you were developing this study for a long time. And maybe you can share with our audience here a little bit of how you got involved with SARC046, which is the nab-sirolimus and EHE, because it didn't happen overnight. It took a long time. Michael, you know what I'm talking about. So maybe
Yeah,
hear how that all
yeah,
developed. Yeah.
yeah. No, it was a few years in the making. So, I actually first became interested in vascular sarcomas as a fellow when I was working uh, in a lab where I was actually working in a lab run by Dr. Neil Sid, who's an ovarian cancer researcher at MD Anderson, but he had been studying angiogenesis and had a lot of the model systems that we needed and just the experience of studying vascular cells in general. And I was working also with Vinod Ravi, who's at MD Anderson, and sort of through that became interested in angiosarcoma and vascular sarcomas in general. And then really my initial focus then was in angiosarcoma. And of course, I'm still interested in studying angiosarcoma. But I think vascular tumors in general, even though they're all very rare, just biologically and scientifically are actually very interesting in terms of how we think about studying and treating them. And this study in particular, SARC046, came about uh, both out of that interest, but then also out of initial data that I think many folks are now aware of, primarily out of the Italian sarcoma group, where they have treated a large number of patients with sirolimus and have seen initial activity with that drug. Nab-sirolimus, of course, is a variation of sirolimus that achieves what we think is a higher concentration of the drug in the tumor itself, and by default, we think has more activity, and that's kind of been demonstrated actually in another rare sarcoma called PCOMA, and that led to the drug's approval, of course, and sort of extrapolating that to EHE, we think that nab-sirolimus might be more effective than sirolimus alone, but we have to prove that.
Well, we said the word EHE a couple times, and maybe you can share with our group what is EHE and what does it stand for, and tell us a little bit about what your understanding of the biology and the natural history of EHE.
Yeah, so it's a very tricky disease. So EHE, of course, stands for Epithelioid Hemangioendothelioma, which is a mouthful, so we say EHE. But it's tricky because many patients with EHE have very indolent disease that just sits there. And even with metastatic disease, a disease that has spread from wherever the tumor started, not everyone needs treatment. And some folks can just be monitored for potentially many, many years with tumors that are just sitting there and they're not growing, they're not doing anything, and we just watch them. But some people have disease that behaves much more aggressively. And those patients will treat similarly to how we would treat anyone with any other metastatic aggressive cancer or sarcoma. And those are really the patients who this study is designed for, where we don't really know what the optimal treatment is because they're so rare. We're only about a little over 100 people are diagnosed with EHE every year in the US, and then only a subset of those patients would actually need systemic treatment. We have learned actually a fair bit about the biology of EHE, where we now know that it's characterized by one of a few different chromosome fusions that involve a pathway called the hippo pathway. So that's a protein signaling pathway that's important for regulating cell growth. And the fusions that happen in EHE tumors essentially lead to sort of irregular cell growth and sometimes rapid cell growth. And other mutations or alterations can come up as the disease evolves over time. But we think that really that initiating or driving factor is the presence of that fusion.
As you said, we've learned a lot about the basic science and the molecular characterization of EHE. And maybe you can share with our group the differences between a pulmonary, bone, liver, and maybe the pleural-based disease, and how that might impact the biology and just the general thinking of those locations as it pertains to the biology.
Yeah, so I can talk, I guess, a little bit about how location might impact the disease course. I'm actually not sure, and this data might exist, I'm just not aware of it, but if there are truly different molecular alterations depending on where the original site of disease is. Um, but we do know that patients who have what we would call serosal disease, so involving either the pleura or the lining around the abdomen organs, so the intestines, um, where disease there can potentially create fluid, and that would either be ascites or pleural effusions. And when those are present, then it becomes a much more aggressive disease and much more difficult to treat disease. Um, but separately, I kind of view EHE collectively, regardless of where it comes up. Treatment wise, we might think of it a little bit differently. So, as an example, especially for patients with primarily or only liver tumors, we'll often do local therapies, meaning either ablations or surgeries to resect the segments of the liver that have the tumor in it. Some folks would even consider a liver transplant. Um, so the treatments certainly can vary depending on where the disease is. The behavior also, we can maybe glean a little bit of information about what to expect. But typically, so if a patient were to come to me with just one time point and is not having any symptoms, so a lot of folks will have these tumors found just incidentally, then usually the first next step that I would do, unless it's very obvious that the disease is growing quickly, like if there's an effusion or something like that, would be to just get another scan and try and get a sense of what's the pace of change of the tumor and really how quickly do we have to act. Because again, going back to the natural history of some of these tumors, many folks will have even metastatic disease that we don't have to do anything about and we can just watch initially.
For a patient hearing this with advanced disease or localized disease, and we're recommending, let's do a surveillance imaging study, it takes them back a little bit. And I do think part of the importance of getting to centers that have expertise in that is you don't want to, because it's their need to actively treat, similar to, I'm not saying they're the same, like desmoid, just because there does not necessarily mean we have to treat, but it goes from almost doing nothing to transplant if it's a liver disease. Not that everyone needs a liver transplant, but to your point, it's a big spectrum. Part of this, you comment that there's probably less than 100 cases in the United States. So we would put that into the ultra rare group. In order for us to gain experience and get centers that have this, I know that you've worked hard with, in collaboration with the EHE Foundation, and maybe you can share how you worked with them in the design of the study and support of the study, and actually how they're going to be active in making sure that when we get this up and running, that they help with accrual as well.
Yeah, so I'll say, I mean, the EHE Foundation has been excellent, both in terms of giving input for the design of the study, but then also just for the support, and then ultimately for what was once we're activated to hopefully spread the word that this is a treatment option, at least on the study, where I've worked especially with Denise Robinson from the foundation to help first with the design, make sure that the questions that we're asking are relevant. And just as a specific example, so embedded in the study, we have PROs or patient reported outcomes, and we actually added the brief pain inventory at the suggestion of the EHE Foundation, because of course pain is an important symptom for patients with EHE, and we want to be able to capture any hopefully improvement in pain with treatment and do it in a quantitative, measurable way, with the hope that we can actually use that information to support the use of the drug if we are really seeing good clinical activity with it. And I think also just in terms of patient education, because for such a rare disease, so many oncologists either have never heard of it or have never seen a patient with EHE, that having a good, close-knit patient network, both as a support system, but then also just for education about the disease, and to help potentially steer people towards high volume sarcoma centers so that they can make sure that they're getting treated, or at least an opinion from someone who is actually familiar with the disease, I think is important and is a really critical thing that the EHE Foundation does, and does, at least as far as I can tell, very well.
No, yeah, we would agree. They're very active. And to your point, they helped inform you and the study team to make sure that the SARC study did include PROS, pain inventory, because in the end, if we can improve the quality of life, pain and quality improve, and spots might not change, that is an asset that we just want to make sure that we don't miss. And their input was very, very helpful. So you are right. This study is also unique. And in the funding mechanism. And maybe you can share with the group how this all came about, because it was touch and go there for a while, but kind of share kind of how we got this, how your team was able to get the funding.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll say, just as a general statement, clinical trial funding for sarcomas is always touch and go for a while. And it generally involves lots of discussions with potential industry partners. If they're able to fund a study, then that tends to be the easiest path, but that's not always the case and wasn't the case here. And then there are lots of foundations that we can apply to for grants to run clinical trials. But then there are also some government mechanisms to fund clinical trials. So I applied for funding through foundation, and then also through actually the U.S. Department of Defense, where they put out a release requesting for applications for specifically for clinical trials for rare cancers. So that fit quite nicely. So we applied for that, and we're fortunate to get the funding through the DoD. So they're actually providing essentially all of the funding for this particular study. We're of course partnering with Adi Biosciences as well, where they were just bought by a Japanese company not too long ago, but they're providing the drug and giving just their expertise about how to handle the drug and potential toxicity and things like that. But the funding really is coming from the U.S. government, and we very much appreciate that.
We're very fortunate that with the new administration and the potential cuts that were coming to research across all centers, that your study was able to withstand and come through. And we do have approval. And I think from our standpoint, from SARC, the first site initiation visits will be later this month. And maybe you can share kind of how many sites that you are looking at that we did get approval for, and kind of what the rollout is for activation.
Yeah, absolutely. So right now we have 5 sites, which we chose based on really just a couple of factors. One is experience treating patients with EHE, and just knowing that there's sufficient number of patients to potentially enroll at each of the sites. And then also for geographic distribution, where we wanted to, at least as best as we could within the limitation of only a few sites, have those sites be spread out to a certain extent across the US. So that's really how we chose the sites. If we have to expand the number, we'll keep those factors in mind and try and choose some additional sites. But right now, because it is a relatively small study, we're going to see if we can start enrollment at those sites and then see how it goes, and potentially expand if needed.
You and I are both at a fairly large, institution with a lot of medical oncologists that deal with sarcoma, but there might be groups that are listening that might be a sarcoma group with higher volume, but only by themselves or maybe with another practitioner. So, and that might have been you've been training at mostly large places, but maybe you can share with you just some general thoughts as what does it mean to work within a group like you are right now at Dana-Farber? Because you're not the only sarcoma person. And as you talked about Vinod Ravi, he's not the only sarcoma person in MD Anderson, but he is kind of one of the vascular sarcoma people there. And how have you and the Dana-Farber group kind of started to develop additional expertise within the general category of sarcoma? Because I think the bigger you are, the more you have that ability.
Yeah, so that's a good question. And I think even from institution to institution, there are varying practices where, at least at Dana-Farber, we all see all sarcomas. We have certain areas of research interest, but at least in the clinic, we don't really limit ourselves. There are some folks who will come, asking specifically to see, one or another person, and we try and honor that as best as possible. But, um, you know, but that is maybe not as common as you might actually think, where really all of us can see any patient with any type of sarcoma. But to be at a big sarcoma center, I think, is excellent because nobody knows everything. And the people who I work with, whether it's here or in Seattle or when I was training, at all the sites I've been, I could just turn my head to the left or right, and there's some very knowledgeable, more experienced person than I am, and I can ask what they would do in this situation. And uh, a lot of times the answer is kind of gray, and it always leads to an interesting discussion about what might be the best thing to do. Um, and I think in terms of for people who are at smaller sites, taking advantage of just the collaborations that form were one thing that I think is nice about the sarcoma academic medical oncology community is that we all know each other and we're all kind of friends. So um, we're more than happy to give advice to anyone who reaches out, and would actually, I would argue at least, would actually prefer that rather than trying to guess about what to do, where we're always just an email or phone call away. And to take advantage of groups like SARC and the other cooperative groups, because even though sarcomas are rare, even being at a large center, for us to actually complete and accrue the number of patients that we would need for SARC046, the only way that I can realistically do that is to work with a group like SARC and have a multi-center collaboration. And anyone can apply to SARC to propose a clinical trial idea.
Absolutely. In fact, some of the miscommunication you and I had as we were trying to get keyed on to this thing is there's so many emails going through, and we said like, well, this is for the podcast. This is separate from the clinical trial concept. But to your point, I think this is important for patients and family members and advocacy groups to understand that even at a big place like Dana-Farber, it's a general sarcoma clinic. Yeah, you have some research interests, but it's not like you have subspecialty interests. Very few centers have that. And we are general sarcoma doctors with interest in vascular, interest in LMS. But in order to move things along, as you said, you could turn to your right, left, up and down at your place, and you're going to get a lot of people's experiences. And I think that makes a huge value. Very few of us have just one specific histology interest, okay? Because we have to be generalists in sarcoma just from the practicalities. But you said yourself, you're trying to build more of an academic research career around vascular sarcoma and whatever that means. There's a huge amount in that space, but you have expertise in a lot of sarcoma, both soft tissue and bone, and all your team members do as well.
Yep, absolutely.
This was a study that took a long time, SARC46. You did talk about, well, This is a Department of Defense grant. There's been value we love, spending time working and developing and working with you in this study here about working with SARC to co-develop this, to provide input and resources. Maybe you can share with the group so other investigators say, hey, I'm going to go get a DOD, but what was it that decided, hey, it's a cooperative group. I needed multi-center to do it. And what was the reason why you decided to come to SARC?
Yeah, so I went to SARC specifically for the sarcoma expertise and the knowledge, and really just the network of large sarcoma centers. Plus, SARC not too long ago completed, I forget the number, but the study of trametinib in EHE or in patients with EHE. And SARC, through that, already had the relationship with EHE Foundation and centers and investigators who specifically were actually interested in EHE, along with the referral patterns for patients, which is, I think, very important for such a rare disease, because even though there are certainly patients who are diagnosed, we have to find them. And, patients come from everywhere. And there already was a track record of successfully completing a clinical trial of about the same size that SARC046 is, in the same patient population.
You bring up that point, Dr. Scott Schutze at University of Michigan ran the EHE study. And that study with trametinib as well was funded in part by the government and supported with input and design with SARC as well. So yeah, you're building up a track record. I know Arang Kim also did the same thing with MPNST. Her and Brigitte had this pipeline, and they just knew how to navigate through DoD awards, bring those studies through SARC. So we love this idea of a pipeline. It took multiple years to get this study. We hope it's going to be positive. We don't know. That's what we're doing it for. But what are your next thoughts, and what are you guys thinking and brewing about that, hey, don't sell anything or tell anybody that you don't want to share, but kind of what do you think? Because it's going to take a couple more years to get the next study developed and launched.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so for EHE specifically, I think there are a few different exciting areas. So of course, SARC046, I think, is one of them, but sort of completely separate in terms of mechanism for trying to treat this disease are the TEAD inhibitors, where Dr. Haddix actually presented the initial results of one of the newer TEAD inhibitors at CTOS, so the big annual sarcoma meeting just a few months ago, where it was a relatively small number of patients, but the likelihood of actually reducing the size of the tumor seemed pretty good with that drug. So of course we want to see more developed or just longer term follow-up and the data from the additional patients who have enrolled on that study. But that's sort of a second angle of attack to try and treat EHE specifically, and what might be the best approach moving forward. Potentially some sort of, I'm talking years, potentially some sort of combination of an mTOR inhibitor like nab-sirolimus with a TEAD inhibitor, or even we can throw trametinib back in somewhere. But we have sort of hints of activity with a number of these drugs, and we have to really just learn what's the best way to use them in a safe way in terms of toxicity, but then also ideally one that mechanistically seems to make sense.
You're very fortunate to have Candace right there next to you in your group there, because to your point, you could just turn right and, hey, Candace, you ran one of our SARC studies for GIST, but now, hey, this might be another option that might be available to keep for EHE or vascular tumors as well. So we're very fortunate that you're in a good center that has collaboration and, helping our patients out, because you need to be kind of coordinated. You need to have studies that have appropriate endpoints. And I know you've worked hard with our statisticians to make sure we get the right endpoints. Some of it is constrained by, the government, what they want for endpoints. But as you said, we're bringing in pros, we're bringing in other aspects to make sure that if this drug does have activity, that we don't miss it. And that's the key part. So I do appreciate you working on this study with us in SARC, and we wish you the best success in getting rapid accrual, appropriate accrual, and that way you can answer the question whether or not nab-sirolimus does it have activity and EHE.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much.
Well, the other part is that we always want to ask people as they are thinking about EHE, sarcoma, SARC046. Well, we don't ask everybody about SARC046, we're only asking you. But if you had a billboard about what you really wanted to share with our audience today, and you just have a billboard and you're driving, what would that billboard be in relation to sarcoma, SARC046, EHE, or anything? What would that be for you?
Yeah, so I think if you're going to ask me about sarcoma in general, then I would say seek an opinion at a high volume sarcoma center. That would be probably the one most important thing. And that includes, I would argue, pathology as well as, potentially even the most important thing. Make sure that the diagnosis is right. And I think that's also something that can be incredibly important for EHE, because a lot of times we'll see someone either get diagnosed with some other vascular tumor that then turns out to be EHE, or even a sort of nonspecific carcinoma I've seen as an initial diagnosis that then turns out to be EHE, where it's just a very tricky diagnosis to make, and it requires a experienced sarcoma pathologist to recognize and actually diagnose it. And that can make a huge difference in terms of treatment and next steps. So I think if there's one takeaway to put on a billboard, it's get evaluated at a high volume multidisciplinary sarcoma center. And then everything should hopefully flow from there.
Yeah, the rest is the rest of the story, but that is correct. I think that is a good thing. On our website, we do have at SARC locations of sarcoma centers across the United States that have high volume. So you can go to our website at SARC to figure those sites out, to get opinion. And as Dr. Wagner said, we're all approachable people. The whole community is willing to collaborate and help each other out. We're helping support each other's career, and getting access to clinical trials is where it's at. And we try to say as a group, the best care is actually a clinical trial. So we're trying to get people to clinical trials, and that's the fun part about what we do. It's hard because there are a lot of different sarcomas, and it's very hard and expensive to keep 70 to 100 different studies for different histologies, but that might be the vision in the future. So Dr. Wagner, any additional thoughts or comments that you might have for our audience as we get to a close here?
No, I'll just reiterate that I think for anyone who's diagnosed with a sarcoma of any sort, that evaluation in a multidisciplinary sarcoma clinic, I think, is the most important thing. And of course, we appreciate all the patients who go on to our clinical trials, because there is unknown about what's going to happen depending on any particular study, whether it's with toxicity or what's the likelihood of the drug working, especially compared to some of the other options. And we can't thank the patients enough who go on to our studies. And I also want to recognize that, especially for sarcomas and ultra rare sarcomas, it's often a lot to ask for patients to travel, both in terms of the financial requirements and time. One thing I'll mention about SARC046 specifically is there is at least some level of travel reimbursement included in the grant. So, if that's the limitation for participation, then, maybe that can at least help. But there are even limits to that as well. So, trial participation is, I think, a promising thing to do, and we're very appreciative of all the patients who enroll, because I consider it a privilege to even be able to offer clinical trials.
That's an excellent point. And, that's why if we had all the money in the world, we'll have the sarcoma study open in your neighborhood. But, we just really can't. And we do appreciate the time commitment, not only for our patients, but their caregivers as well. Because many of these individuals come not by themselves, but with care members, family members and friends and family. So we do appreciate the effort that it takes. And we thank everybody's effort on that. So Dr. Wagner, again, thank you for sharing your time, your expertise with our audience. And we wish you all the success in accruing for SARC046 this year. And we look forward to what 2026 and beyond shares. So thanks again for spending time with us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
For those that are listening, thank you again. Our next episode will be next month. Please drop any comments that you might have. We do look at it, and we look forward to our next SARC Talk.
Thank you for listening to SARC Talk. Be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. To learn more about SARC, visit us at sarctrials.org. If you have questions or would like to suggest a topic, email us at sarctalk@sarctrials.org. SARC Talk is made possible through the generous support of EHE Pharmaceuticals. Together, we can find a cure for all forms of sarcoma.